What if the way you were taught World War I works is missing the main plot? In most school versions, the story starts in Sarajevo. An archduke is shot, alliances lock into place, and suddenly the world is at war. But that's like explaining the Titanic by saying, it hit ice. You're describing the visible trigger, not the deeper conditions that made disaster almost unavoidable. So, let's ask a different question. What if the real cause of World War I wasn't the assassination itself, but a financial system that had quietly pushed Europe's powers into insolvency long before 1914? What if that bullet in the Balkans simply provided the political justification for a massive restructuring of unpayable debts? In this video, we're going to follow the money instead of the bullets. You'll see how escalating public debts transformed politics into a series of financial obligations, and how a war we usually describe in terms of trenches and gas attacks also functioned as the most ambitious debt workout in history. Our story starts back in the mid-19th century. In the 1850s, European governments discovered a powerful formula. You could raise capital on international markets and use borrowed money to build an empire much faster than traditional conquest ever allowed. Britain embraced this first and hardest. It floated huge bond issues and loans to extend railways across India, construct ports and bases along key routes, and maintain a global navy capable of projecting power almost anywhere. Instead of waiting for tax revenue to catch up, the British state pulled future income into the present and spent it on imperial infrastructure and military might. As long as the empire expanded and trade increased, this model looked sustainable. New markets brought in customs revenues, colonies provided raw materials, shipping lanes generated fees and profit. The interest bill on Britain's swelling public debt, while large, still seemed manageable on paper. But underneath, risks were accumulating. By 1914, British national debt had reached around $650 million. Managing that load required stable access to credit, careful control over interest payments, and the assumption that confidence in British bonds would never collapse. Other powers copied this borrowing-led expansion. France financed colonial ventures in North and West Africa. Germany bankrolled railroads, ports, and naval programs. Russia poured money into industrialization and military modernization. They believed they were competing over territory and prestige. In reality, they had tied themselves into a competition based on who could borrow the most and service interest the longest. If you want a personal analogy, think again about mortgages. You don't just decide to buy a house. You sit down, look at your income, shop for a rate, and make sure the monthly payments won't crush you. Now imagine your neighbors keep buying bigger houses, doing huge renovations, and bragging about holiday homes. Even if you're cautious by nature, you feel pressure to level up. This is how the arms race and imperial race worked. Each dreadnought laid, each new army course, each colonial venture wasn't just a strategic move. It was a financial commitment backed by bond markets. Competition for prestige turned into competition over debt capacity. Germany illustrates this perfectly. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II, Germany pursued place in the sun ambitions, challenging British sea power, carving out colonies in Africa and the Pacific, and investing heavily in rail and industrial infrastructure. All of that required capital. Berlin's leaders reassured themselves that each new acquisition would eventually pay its own way through concessions, resource extraction, and trade surpluses. If that sounds like the optimism of the 2000s housing boom, real estate only goes up. That's because the underlying psychology was similar. Debt burdens were justified by projecting future gains that might or might not arrive. To see the endgame of this logic, you only have to look at the Ottoman Empire. It reached the red line first. In 1875, crushed by obligations of about $200 million, the Ottoman state announced that it could no longer meet its payments. At that point, more than 50% of its revenue went to debt service alone. European creditors responded by imposing the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This wasn't a normal bankruptcy court. It was a foreign-run authority with the power to collect certain taxes and oversee key revenue streams on Ottoman soil, all for the benefit of bondholders. On the map, the empire still existed. The Sultan still issued commands and appeared in ceremony, but major financial choices were now heavily constrained by outsiders. This was a prototype for what we might call financial protectorates today. states whose formal sovereignty hides deep external control through debt. By the early 1900s, Europe had quietly fused finance and security. The Declaration of London in 1914 acknowledged credit as a crucial part of the Anglo-French-Russian security framework. Alliances were becoming not just military partnerships, but financial ones. To join, you didn't just promise soldiers. You effectively promised to share war costs, coordinate borrowing, and accept that your solvency was linked to your allies' solvency. On the eve of World War I, every major European power was stuck in a similar predicament. Debts were huge. Military budgets consumed vast chunks of government spending. The only way to make the math look plausible was to assume continued growth, continued access to credit, and possibly future gains from expansion. More borrowing funded more armies and fleets, which justified more borrowing. The feedback loop was unstable. At some point, ordinary politics could no longer solve the equation. Something dramatic had to happen, either a collapse or a radical reset. War offered both a story and a toolkit. The story was defense and honor. The toolkit was emergency financial powers, new taxes, controls on capital, forced loans, and central bank interventions that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Victory, if it came, also promised material rewards, territories, resources, and reparations that could be used to plug holes in government balance sheets. The rulers of Europe weren't just painting more of the map in their national colors. They were trying to keep their financial systems from imploding under the weight of compounding interest. Once the war began, the financial dimension escalated quickly. By 1916, Britain had assumed a role that's hard to overstate. It wasn't only paying for its own troops and ships. London was covering the vast majority of imperial war costs worldwide, fully funding Italy's war expenditures and paying roughly 2/3 of what France and Russia were spending to fight. Pause on that. One country was attempting to finance a multi-front world war for several allies at once. That was only possible because British credit still commanded trust across global markets, and because a sophisticated web of banks, discount houses, and central institutions kept the mechanism turning. To see how deeply finance and war were intertwined, consider J.P. Morgan Jr. again. In 1915, 2 years before the United States formally entered the war, Morgan was already acting as the chief purchasing agent for the British government in America. His firm coordinated contracts for weapons, ammunition, and supplies. That same year, he organized a loan of $500 million to the Allies, backed by a syndicate of roughly 2,200 U.S. banks. But the key clause was control. Allied governments agreed that their American purchases would run through Morgan-affiliated companies. That gave one Wall Street titan enormous leverage over Allied logistics. This raises an uncomfortable question. If a foreign private banker effectively manages your arms procurement, how fully independent are you? Britain, the empire of global trade, had in practice outsourced the financial backbone of its war effort to Wall Street. The lion was depending on the eagle not just for weapons, but for credit. As European states piled on more loans, interest rates did what they usually do under heavy demand. They climbed. Servicing old debt became harder. Taking on new debt got more expensive. Expansion abroad, winning territory, and extracting resources went from being a strategic ambition to a kind of financial necessity. France and Russia, with enormous but vulnerable gold reserves, leaned on those reserves to secure foreign loans and maintain confidence. In alliance discussions, who had how much gold and access to which credit markets became just as important as how many soldiers they could mobilize. Germany pursued its own version of money creation. The Reichsbank advanced short-term credit to the government, while repeated war loans converted these floating obligations into long-term bonds held by the public. Economists now see this as a primitive form of monetizing government debt. The state was printing and borrowing to keep its war machine running, hoping future victory would provide the assets to square the books. In financial terms, European governments were selling victory-backed securities. Investors bought bonds in the expectation that the winning side would squeeze enough from the losers to repay everything. Hovering over all of this were the major merchant banks. Houses like Rothschild, Baring, Morgan, Kleinwort, and Schroeder financed infrastructure, floated government bonds, and underwrote large-scale investment. They also had portfolios heavily tilted toward specific countries and alliances. These firms were not disinterested bystanders. Their profitability depended on which governments survived and which currencies remained stable. Imagine a present-day scenario in which leading global banks extend huge loans to rival states in the same conflict zone, tied to outcomes on the battlefield, and also dominate those states' access to advanced weaponry. It's easy to see how, in that situation, neutrality becomes a fiction. By 1916, international lending had woven together creditor and debtor interests so tightly that defeat meant more than territorial losses. It meant financial ruin, defaults cascading through the system, long-term exclusion from capital markets, and, very likely, some version of the foreign financial supervision already imposed on the Ottoman Empire. That fear of what would happen if they lost is one reason the war escalated into a brutal struggle of attrition. The participants weren't just worried about national pride. They understood that losing could mean decades of economic control by their enemies' bankers. So, when we talk about total war, we should hear total exposure. Governments adopted policies that threw entire societies into the furnace rather than risk the consequences of an unfavorable peace with large unpaid debts. Now, let's shift to the United States, because this is where the official story and the financial story diverge sharply. The usual narrative is that America tried to stay out of the conflict until submarine warfare and diplomatic provocations left it no choice. The financial narrative tells you that, by the time the U.S. entered the war in 1917, it had already become deeply entangled on the Allied side through credit. We've already met J.P. Morgan Jr. as the Allied purchasing agent. By 1915, his consortium had arranged about $1.5 billion in loans to Britain and France, equivalent to tens of billions in today's dollars. These deals didn't just provide liquidity. They tied Allied survival to a network of American banks whose profits depended on a decisive Allied win. As the war dragged on, private loans weren't enough. The U.S. government itself stepped in. Through the Treasury, Washington extended more than $10 billion in credits to foreign governments. In just 4 years, the United States flipped from being a net debtor in world finance to being the leading global creditor. One institutional innovation made this possible: the Federal Reserve, created in 1913. The Fed unified and stabilized the American banking system and allowed for coordinated expansion of the money supply. Without this central bank, the scale and speed of wartime lending to Europe would have been far more limited. By the time Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, the financial stakes were enormous. A decisive Allied loss would have meant defaults on a massive stack of loans sitting on American books. The health of the U.S. financial system itself was now bound to Allied victory. Think again about that simple analogy. You've lent all your savings to a friend in a dangerous fight. If they lose, your money is gone. If they win, you get your savings back, plus interest. Under those conditions, neutrality becomes increasingly hard to maintain. When American troops finally landed in Europe, they were told they were fighting to make the world safe for democracy. On a balance sheet, they were also defending the solvency of debtors who owed U.S. institutions staggering sums of money. At the same time, the U.S. domestic economy was booming. Allied demand for American grain, metals, coal, and manufactured goods supercharged U.S. industry. War orders created jobs, filled factories, and poured profits into corporations and banks. European states, by contrast, were stripping their capital stock, losing manpower, and destroying infrastructure. By the end of the war, the economic center of gravity had shifted. The old European creditors had become debtors. The United States, which had once borrowed heavily from Europe to build railroads and industry, now held the IOUs. The fighting stopped in November 1918, but the money story continued. What followed wasn't peace in a meaningful sense. It was a gigantic, messy, multi-decade restructuring of sovereign debts, fronted by conferences and treaties. Take Britain. Its national debt exploded from under £1 billion before the war to several times that amount by 1919. Figures often cited around $7,181 million. France, Germany, Italy, and others faced similar or worse proportional increases. These debts couldn't simply be ignored. They had creditors, payment schedules, and political stakes. The Treaty of Versailles institutionalized a particular solution. Germany was to pay reparations to the Allies, especially Britain and France. In theory, This would fund reconstruction and help the victorious powers service their war debts. But Germany didn't have piles of spare cash. To make reparations payments, it borrowed heavily from foreign lenders, with American banks playing a central role. Those borrowed funds then flowed to Britain and France as reparations, and from there back across the Atlantic to satisfy Allied obligations to the U.S. government and U.S. investors. So, the money moved in a circle. American banks financed Germany. Germany paid reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France paid interest to American creditors. On paper, these were separate transactions with separate treaties. In practice, they formed a single interconnected system. Between 1919 and 1932, Germany transferred about 19 billion gold marks in reparations. Over that same period, it received around 27 billion gold marks in loans, much of it from the United States. Germany became the debtor, through which American funds cycled to other European states and back to American lenders. This structure gave outside powers enormous leverage over German policy. Reparations were not only about money, they also embedded foreign interests deep inside Germany's fiscal and economic choices. European leaders had gone into the war telling their populations they were defending civilization and national honor. Afterward, many of them expected some form of mutual accommodation on debts among allies. U.S. officials and bankers, by contrast, saw wartime lending as business. Contracts were contracts. Interest was owed regardless of shared sacrifice. That clash shaped the interwar period, when European governments had to choose between satisfying creditors and funding domestic programs, schooling, and reconstruction. They often prioritized debt service, not because they were heartless, but because the alternative default threatened isolation from capital markets and renewed crisis. The most shocking part is how long this arrangement lasted. Germany didn't fully complete payments linked to its World War I obligations until 2010. Britain continued paying off war-related debts until 2006. France did so until 2009. Millions of people paid taxes their entire lives without realizing that part of that money was still going to settle accounts from a conflict their great-grandparents had barely survived. That's the real legacy of World War I as a financial event. The war ended as a military conflict, but lived on through a century of bond coupons, interest payments, and policy constraints. Meanwhile, the financial institutions that dominated wartime lending emerged strengthened. They had proven that war and crisis could be turned into long-term revenue streams. The model was clear: lend heavily to states in emergencies, structure the debt so it lasts for generations, and use the need to maintain credibility to influence their policies. Throughout the 20th century, versions of this pattern recurred from post-war reconstruction to Cold War proxy conflicts to modern sovereign debt crises. Governments facing emergencies borrow. Years later, when public attention has shifted, those debts still shape budgets, elections, and social policy. This is why, in our time, sovereign debt crises so often end in austerity packages that protect creditors while cutting public services. It's why financial clauses dominate peace deals and international agreements. It's why political leaders talk about markets, as if they were another electorate they have to appease. World War I set a precedent. Large-scale, debt-financed conflicts that reshape not just borders, but also the global hierarchy of creditors and debtors. The war didn't just redistribute territory, it redistributed financial power, locking in a system where human welfare is frequently overridden by the need to service past borrowing. Think back to those images of monarchs and ministers signing declarations and treaties in ornate rooms. They weren't just carving up land. They were locking their countries into financial obligations that would outlast them by nearly a century. The war to end all wars did not abolish war. It helped make war financially manageable and, for some institutions, profitable. Since 1918, almost every major conflict has come with its own wave of borrowing, followed by years or decades of repayment. So, when you look at the 20th and 21st centuries, don't just ask who won which battle. Ask who funded whom, who held the debt, and who collected the interest afterward. That is the story that began in earnest with World War I. On the battlefield, millions died. On the balance sheet, the big bankers emerged as the enduring winners. And in many ways, we're still living inside the system their war created.